I've just wanted to give a very brief series of thoughts about the issue of leverage, and I think I've got 4 parts to my presentation. So first, what does it mean? Then second, how is it done? And then third, what kind of questions should we be asking when we see anyone claiming to have leveraged money from the private sector? And then fourth, just some other critical things to think about. So that's what I'm going to do, hopefully take about 5 minutes. So what is leverage? Now, it's actually very confusingly used. So when we're talking about leveraging, there's, if you like, 3 meanings. There's the general meaning, that what people actually mean is some kind of power dynamic. You get someone to do something that you want them to do. There's the financial meaning, which is about using credit to leverage your speculative capacity. And then there's the meaning that's come into play in the development debates. And this definition is from the World Bank. So using some kind of public financial commitment to mobilize private capital for some specific project. So that third definition, if you like, is where I think we're going to focus today. But actually, when you look through the way people use leverage in development and climate debates, they mix all 3 of those definitions up, depending on what it is they want to do. So we have to be a bit careful of that. So how is it measured? Again, there's no kind of standardized method, but normally people talk about the ratio of public to private investment. So they might say it's a kind of 3 to 1 or a 1 to 3 leverage ratio, or a 10 to 1 or a 1 to 10 leverage ratio. But sometimes they talk about the grant element to the private investment. So they say by putting in $1 of grant money, we can borrow $10 on the capital markets, and that pulls in $90 of private money, and so you have a leverage ratio of 101 to 1 or something. So that sometimes confuses things. And as I said, sometimes the general uses is meant, and they talk about catalytic investments that could change the whole way, for example, the climate sector, renewable energy sector works, and they're not really talking about pulling in money, they're really talking about changing the policy framework or changing in some way the economic environment. And then the third thing to watch out for is that what I would call pooled financing is often called leverage. So the World Bank will say, we leverage money from the Asian Development Bank. Well, then the Asian Development Bank could equally well say, well, we leverage money from the World Bank. So people start leveraging each other, and it gets a bit complicated and confusing. So this is quite simplistic, but hopefully quite helpful. I think there's 3 ways that you might think about leveraging. So if you're interested in using your public money or public guarantees to get private investment somewhere, you can do it through loans, through financial intermediaries. So you can say, okay, we'll give some money to a bank, and then the bank will lend a larger multiple of that money out to other people. You could use equity or private equity funds. So you could put a direct equity investment and say, by doing that, we are now allowing this bank or this financial institution to lend lots of money to lots of people and become strong and healthy. Or you could put some money into a private equity fund. And this is often the area where the most controversy is caused, I think, because private equity firms don't always have such a good reputation, because what they essentially try to do is to buy up firms and make money out of the increased value of those firms later on. And they can do that by improving the firms, but they could equally well do that by asset stripping and other dubious methods. Then you could have other kinds of investment funds. Then the third area, which is quite big, particularly in the World Bank where we focus, is risk management finance. So you can give a guarantee to funds, or you can provide insurance that allows, if you like, private investors to have the confidence to make the investments that they want to make. So I think, broadly speaking, you can think of different ways of interacting with private investors in those 3 different instruments. Then my third point is, what kind of questions should we be asking as people who are interested in examining, is this any good for development and climate? And I think there's 4 key ones. So first one, is there any actual financial additionality? Is the public investment that's going in helping to make that private investment happen, or would that private investment have happened anyway? And if it would have happened anyway, then I would argue you're basically just subsidizing a private investment, which is probably something you don't want to be doing. And my great genius thought is that if if the leverage ratio is very high, then probably that investment would have happened anyway. So if you're talking about 100 to 1 leverage ratio, the one element in that has very little influence over what happens, I would argue. Second point is a crucial one. Are there actually any development or climate impacts coming out of this? And I think often that is, although is assumed, it's like if we can get more money, more investment in this area or in this sector, then we must have good impacts. And I don't think we should make that assumption, particularly when you are dealing with private actors who don't share your objectives and who are obviously looking to make returns as their primary objective. And the third point is also, I think, often overlooked. Are we actually supporting national strategies in developing countries, or are we just doing what we think is right because it's the way of getting lots of money in? So that both applies to their development strategies or their climate strategies, but also, I think, quite importantly, to their strategies for their financial sector. Because very often you might be having quite a significant impact on their financial sector, and what we've seen in recent years is that's actually quite important for macroeconomic stability and growth and lots of other things. And then fourth point is the opportunity cost point, which is probably something where NGOs have been quite strong, saying, well, okay, if you put that money into this complex vehicle and that leverages private finance, that might be fine, but you could also have done something else with that money or that guarantee. And is there, in fact, for example, enough public investment in some areas, and should we be spending our aid money, for example, in those areas? So there's an opportunity cost always to any decision. So those, I think, are the questions we should ask. And then just the fourth, I listed some other concerns that I've got or that people have raised about this issue, which, so I've mentioned already financial sectors are important for macroeconomic policy. There's huge concerns about transparency and accountability, particularly when you start involving financial institutions, partly because if you put money through a bank or through a private equity fund, it's difficult to know where that money ends up, and partly because those institutions often have legal requirements that they can't disclose publicly what they're doing with that money. So there's a great deal of difficulty with transparency, and I think accountability. There's a number of cases coming up at the IFC through the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, which are about these kinds of investments, which take, for example, there's one in India on a coal plant that was invested through an investment fund that the IFC had put money into, and it took a long time for anyone to realise that the bad impacts of that plant were being financed through a financial intermediary from the IFC. So there's huge accountability concerns because from a starting point, affected people don't even know, for example, that development finance is being used in certain ways. And then finally, I've mentioned it already, but we must be careful to know what the motivations of the actors that we're engaging with are. So obviously, most private actors are interested in making money, and some of them might also have social elements to their makeup. And different types of actors behave in different kinds of ways. And I think a lot of the concern about private equity funds is because we know in general terms they're looking for very large returns and often might not behave in ways that you can necessarily predict when you make your initial agreement with them. So that's the end of me. I don't know how long I took, but hopefully less than my time allotted. Back to Sarah.